Authors Over 50, Writing in Life's Sweetest Third. Authors Over 50's weekly podcast celebrates writers and their journeys to publication. Writing after 50 is a whole story on its own, so let's skip to life's sweetest third and talk with authors about their journey from pen to publish. Welcome. I'm Julia Daly, your host, and I invite you to listen to interviews with writers who've achieved their goal of publishing a book just later in life. We've seen award lists for under 30 or under 40, but I've yet to see lists for those who've achieved a significant milestone of their own, launching a new career and publishing their first book after the age of 50. We will hear about these authors' inspirations, struggles, strategies, and the smell of that first book. These writers' journeys inspire me because I'm one of them. My guest today is a nurse and writer. She writes and sometimes lives stories about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances where they learn that life is rarely predictable and answers to the most complex questions are rarely black and white. House on Fire, her debut novel, was longlisted for the 2022 Petrichor Prize and was released in March of 2023. It tackles agonizing subjects of love and loss, dementia, and assisted suicide. Welcome to Authors Over 50, Dee Liebhart.
Hi, nice to be here.
Our opening question on Authors Over 50 is always, what took you so long to write your first book?
Well, I think probably like a lot of folks my age, this is not really my first book. It's my first published book, but I wrote my first novel when I was about 25 years old and realized that I had no idea how to write a novel. And so then I spent probably about 10 years taking classes, learning how to write short stories, learning how to, really write, and then wrote my second novel when I was 35. And I know exactly when it was because I wrote the very first draft while I was pregnant. I was determined to get it done before I had, my daughter. And then I spent about 10 years revising that book for a number of reasons, only to abandon it and then finally start on this book. So, I take a long time to revise and work on stuff. And so I think that's how I ended up here now.
I do think that's the answer to a lot of those questions from people in our age group. And we all seem to have a novel that's still in the desk drawer, that we don't want anybody to see. But I think we had to learn our craft on some of those books.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think you're, jumping out of the gate with your first novel is probably a bad idea, unless you're, someone like Dave Eggers, but most of the time it's a bad idea.
Deborah, I'm always curious about writers taking a name different than their own. What inspired you to write under a pseudonym?
Well, I am a working nurse and I write about very controversial subjects, and I like to keep those two things separate. I also very occasionally appear in research papers under my real name. And so I just want those things to be very separate. And I like having an element of control over those things so that, so that I control my privacy in that regard about these topics.
That makes sense. When you wrote this book, how did you proceed? Did you search for an agent, decide to choose a hybrid, a small press, or did you self-publish?
Well, I started out like a lot of folks, going down the traditional publishing route, and I did a lot of querying, and I was querying actually probably, now in retrospect, I'm like the worst time ever. I was querying during the pandemic. And so I write, this is a very serious book. It's got funny parts in it, but it's about a very serious topic. And in that time frame, I think that's not really what agents were looking for. I got, repeated where I would get people reading the whole book and they would say, I love it, but, I don't want to represent you. And so I think after a certain amount of time, I considered where I was at. I considered, all my options, and I felt like I think my age played a factor. I was like, I don't want to wait any longer. I'd like to take this into my own hands and kind of take control of it. So I did end up independently publishing it. And I have to say, at this point, at first I felt, pretty negative about it, like very defeated. But now I definitely feel like it was the right choice for me. It's very positive. It's been a very positive experience. And I think one of the things I think that's changed, I know for me, one of the things I was overcoming was the idea that, independently published books are bad books. And I think that comes from, 20, 30 years ago. And now I think there's a lot more wide audience, and independent publishing is very much the forefront of getting a variety of books out into our community. So I think that it was the right choice for me. In fact, right now I have another novel that I'm about to pitch to an agent, and I started thinking to myself, like, do I even want this? Is this what I want? Because I'm also working with a cover designer that I worked with on House on Fire, whom I love. And I was like, I get to pick the cover, I get to pick the title, I get to have that control. So I think it's a hard thing to decide. And I think current publishing is pretty tough. The model of publishing now is very narrow. I like to call it kind of like the Hollywood model. They're looking for the blockbuster. They're not looking to publish 1,000 interesting stories. They're looking, for the Martian movie that's going to make, $1 billion or something like that. So I feel like this is a more diverse way of publishing.
We just have so many options these days. And you're right, indie published books, you often and most times cannot tell them from one of the top 5 publishers. And I think in the back of our minds, we all want some type of acknowledgement that someone wants our book, so we try to pitch to agents, but why can't we acknowledge that we want our own book? And there are many readers who want to read those stories that we have to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even if there aren't many readers, I'm amazed at how many people write in these very, very tight niche audiences, and there's readers and they're successful. And so then that book needed to be there for those people, and no matter how small that audience is. So I think that's really very important. And I think also the myth, I think we're always playing with the myth of I'm going to be, the superstar. I'm going to be, make $1 million. And the truth is that most writers of any kind don't do that. And that the majority of people making their living at writing are actually independently published. So it's like what we see on the surface and what is actually the truth are two very different things.
Trying to find our voice out in the marketplace with 2 million books a year, 2 million titles being released, it's just almost impossible. But, it's a dream of ours and we want to do it. And I always want to know, what does success look like to you personally? Because I think that's most important when we decide to publish a book.
Well, it's really interesting, that question, because when you think about it, you have all these notions of like, making money or whatever. And then when I thought about that question, really, it's where I'm at now. Like I have a book that people that I don't know can buy and do buy and read, and then, send me a letter or, comment on the ad that they saw it on. Wow, I loved this book. And I was like, that's it, really. That's all I ever was looking for, was to try to find my readers. Now I'd like to find more of them, so that's the new goal. But I think just having the book exist and having me be able to say, like, here it is, this is my book, and more importantly, I think be proud of it. Like, I think it's a very good book. And so those two things I think are enough for me. And now going forward, I have a few more books that I'm working on, and I'm hoping in the next maybe 4 or 5 years to publish 4 or 5 books and then see where I'm at that point.
Well, you must have quite a writing routine if you're publishing that many books in those few years and holding a full-time job. Tell us about your writing routine. Are you a morning person, a night person? It's got to be challenging to get those hours in.
Well, I'm definitely a night person in general, but my job requires me to be a morning person. And I don't write when I work. So I work 10-hour shifts, and so I don't write on those days. I write on my days off. I'm a very fast first drafter. So I'll tend to set myself a word count goal. And so right now I'm working on a memoir. And so I have a 2,500 word goal every week. And so what I'll do is however many days I have to write, I will divide that up. And so if it's 3 days, I'll divide that up and I'll say, okay, I'm going to write 800 words today. And I'm very good at first drafting with not looking back. So I start at the very beginning. I always know where I'm going, and I just write through, and then I'll come back and start revising. And the book that I'm revising right now, I wrote, gosh, I think in 2020 was the first draft. So I take a long time to revise. I definitely do that. So I'm trying to get better at that process. But yeah, definitely for me, it's word count goals. I mean, I know some people are very successful with time goals, but I could sit in a chair and look at my computer for a couple hours and, be like, oh, I didn't do anything. So.
Well, you would do very well during November, NaNoWriMo. That's the novel writing month, and you sign up for the challenge to write 50,000 words in the month of November. And I tried that. I was one of those who would write a few sentences and go back and edit. I was very slow. And in NaNoWriMo, you have to just get the words on paper so you'll have something to edit at the end of the month. But those word counts will really keep you going if you're going to meet the challenge.
Did you do it? Did you get the 60,000?
I
Yeah,
did.
50,000.
I
Yeah,
did.
yeah.
It was
Good.
wild how many words a day. It's like 1,680 words a day or something like that.
And it doesn't matter. I think the big thing is it doesn't matter in a first draft whether they're good or not. And
Yeah.
I think that's the dilemma is like you want it to be perfect the first go around and it's not. So just get it out because then you can be like, oh, that's no good. Let's go back and fix that.
Did publishing the first book change your process of writing for these next books to come?
One of the things, like I mentioned, I took 10 years to revise a novel. And it wasn't just, I mean, I went back to school, I had a little kid, I made an international move. I did lots of things that interfered with it. So it wasn't just me, revising. But I think the thing that I learned from that was to get someone engaged much earlier in the process. I love writing and I could write in isolation, forever, really, probably. And I think that for me, getting someone engaged early is the key. And I did that with House on Fire. I immediately, as soon as the first draft was finished, the second draft, I worked in the Humber School for Writers, which is through a Canadian university. I got partnered with Jamie Attenberg. And so that was wonderful. That was absolutely brilliant in terms of getting the book, better faster. And so for the book that I'm revising right now, I did the same thing, not through a class. I actually hired a developmental editor, Tiffany Yates Martin, and she and I have been working on the book together. So I think that's the big thing that I learned very early is that I have a tendency to just play with words for a really long time, and I need to if my intent is publishing, if my intent is just to write, then that's fine. But if my intent is publishing, then I need to get somebody involved a lot faster. And so that's a big thing I think that's changed.
And Tiffany is a wonderful editor and very well respected in the industry. And so I'm sure working with her honed your craft and made that book so that you can't tell it from the big five publishers.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's a good thing too, is working with somebody who's really, at the top of their game in terms of editing and being willing to listen. I think that's a huge thing too. I've been in critique groups and I kind of pulled back from my local critique group, not because they were, bad or anything, but because of the amount of time invested. And you spend a lot of time reading other people's work, which is great. It's really important. But at some point, you're like, I just want to focus on my book, and I do work full time, so it's a matter of like, well, I would rather just focus on my book right now. So.
You mentioned loving to write, and we do love to write, but sometimes we don't like to promote ourselves. So, have you found anything in the publicity realm that's worked for you, or maybe something you've tried that hasn't worked?
So, I mean, this is where I would consider myself like an utter failure. Like I'm terrible at self promotion. I honestly, I was off all social media for 10 years prior to this book. I was perfectly happy. And it was like a moral challenge for me to determine that I was really shooting myself on the foot if I didn't at least try to be on social media. I would say right now, not a success at it much at all. I'm learning, step by step, I'm really trying to focus on one thing at a time. Like I'm going to learn this one thing, I'm going to learn how to do this, and then I'll move to the next thing. And right now it's Facebook ads. I'm really learning Facebook ads, and they're working really well for me. So I'd say that's a good focal point is focusing on one thing and then really understanding it before you move to the next thing. So.
What about any specific books or seminars or writing retreats or groups that you can share that might have improved your writing journey?
I did and I wish I would have done it in a different order. I participated in another Canadian university, University of British Columbia, has a brilliant 3-part series that they do. It's not exactly independent study, but it's somewhat independent study. There's lots of connection in the community, but there's not a lot of one-on-one with you and the instructors. But it's the first draft is one class, revising is the next class, and then polishing is the next class. And it's the single best course I've ever seen. I wish I would have done that first and then done the Humber School for Writers. I think that would have been a better order. That was just brilliant. And then I really like Lisa Cohn's books. I hate to say because they make you feel terrible while you're reading them. At least like for me, I was like, oh, I did that. That's terrible. But they really teach you how to not make the big mistakes that a lot of folks make. So I really like that Story Genius and Wired for Story. Those are both brilliant books.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about the passage you've brought to share today and then read from your book so we can hear your tone and voice?
Well, I'd like to read, if it's okay, just the very first paragraph, because it really sets the book up. And then I'm going to jump to another section that'll make sense after the first paragraph. Okay. My mother asked me to kill my father on Christmas. I remember it was Christmas because it isn't the kind of thing you forget. And if I have to pick a beginning for this tragedy, that's as good a place as any. Aristotle was wrong. Tragedies don't have structure. They don't line up neatly into 3 acts. Tragedy prefers the blind side. You're sitting at the intersection waiting for the light when bam, it comes out of nowhere.
Wow. That grabs us from the very beginning. That was beautiful.
And that's really what that whole first chapter is about, how that topic comes up. But then this section that I'm going to read is a little bit more explanation of what actually happened.
Okay.
This is between the main character and her best friend. The nearly deserted lobby has an eeriness to it, a silence laden with possibility. JJ's sandwich shop with its bright lights and faint tinkling of music was the only sign of life. It was like walking down a darkened street and finding the last open nightclub. Kara and a single housekeeper at the other end of the food court were the only people around. I sat down and picked up the tuna sandwich she'd bought me. Is Elliot skiing? I asked, feeling like an idiot as soon as I said it. I knew Elliot was skiing. Kara frowned. You're doing it again. What? Making small talk because you don't want to speak the big thing. If you're lucky, you've got 20 minutes before I have to check on that clown, Dr. Waring. She held up her iPhone as if everyone's least favorite new surgical fellow was trapped inside it. You better pick up the pace. My mom asked me to euthanize my dad today. Kara's eyes widened. That's a bombshell to drop on Christmas. I know. Then after I pretty much convinced myself she's just emoting, Shane says she'll probably do it on her own if I don't help. Then I find this story on the internet about some old guy in England who did exactly that. Strangled his wife because she had dementia and didn't want to go into a home. Needless to say, I did not sleep a wink. How serious do you think she was? I don't know. I guess he's gotten a lot worse recently. I told her about my father getting lost and what my mother had said about his behavior. then explained about the promise. It's like my dad closed and locked all these doors and we have nowhere to go. Your poor mom, Kara said softly. If he had a terminal condition like cancer and was in his right mind, it would be totally different. But he's not in his right mind because of his terminal condition. He's not really terminal, I said. It's semantics, isn't it? He's not going to get better, and this is going to kill him, just slowly. We both turned as we heard shouts from the other side of the food court. 2 security guards ran down the walkway toward the front desk. Drive by, I asked. MVA, lots of family. Not my case. At night, visitors had to sign in and show identification at the front entrance. With drive-bys, these visitors were sometimes gang members trying to finish a job. With motor vehicle accidents, MVAs, it could be family members who weren't allowed in because a legal next of kin hadn't been identified, because the crisis was still being managed. This particular commotion seemed under control. I turned back to Kara. I thought you were going to go all Hippocratic oath on me, I said. Tell me how there's no way I can even think about this. Is that what you want me to do? Well, right now you sound like you think I should do it, which is kind of freaking me out more. She shook her head. I don't think I have a right to an opinion, but I get your mom's thought process. What if he was an ALS patient who wanted to die but waited too long and couldn't physically do it himself? His wishes didn't change, but now he's trapped inside a body that doesn't work and the option's gone. To your mom, nothing's changed. Your dad's the same person who didn't want to live like this, but now he doesn't have the ability to do anything about it. Assisted suicide seems like a kindness. That's the problem. It would be murder, not assisted suicide. Technically, but there's no but. Murder simpliciter. If this was assisted suicide, I'd be fine with it, or at least I think I would. But this is figuring out how to murder someone and not get caught. Are you trying to figure it out? Honestly, I don't know what I'm thinking. You know, every nurse up on that unit up there would tell you they have a pact with someone to help them end it if they get like my dad. But how? It's not like you can get a prescription for Nebutol. Kara raised an eyebrow. Yes, I said. I got stuck into a website claiming to sell Nebutol and then some message board about buying it from unscrupulous veterinarians in Mexico. Nebutol would definitely be the kindest way to do it, she said. Kind and totally illegal.
Well, Deborah, you have really sucked us in. We want to read the rest of that. Those are weighty subjects, but topics that so many of us, think about.
Yeah, and I think that I try very hard to be very balanced. There's very much different opinions throughout the book, and different ways of looking at it. And I think the other thing is that the main character in particular is an ICU nurse. So this is someone who's very familiar with death, who sees death all the time. And so to be in this situation where you've taken someone who's, because of their job, forced to keep people alive beyond when they think would be okay. And then in this situation with her own family member being very limited in what she's allowed and able to do.
Do you have to complete any research before you begin or as you go along, or is being a nurse enough to know what you're going to write in this book?
So in this book, this is a topic that I'm particularly passionate about and knowledgeable about, is like end of life law and end of life wishes and things like that. So probably not as much research as I've had to do for my new book. I definitely do research kind of as I go, where I'm starting to write something and I'm like, is that even true? Like, I don't even know that that's true. And then I have to go back and look it up. So I think the thing that I knew about, there's a book called The Peaceful Pill, which is about that drug, Nebutol. And so I was familiar with that book. I'm also familiar with The Final Exit. And so that was probably like research that I'd already done, but just details like that, like, what happens when you Google it? What happens when you look these things up? And that little passage about that British gentleman, that's a true story. There was a gentleman who strangled his wife to death. They'd been married for something like 60 years. And so those kinds of things, that you bring in authenticity and to that true experience that this character would have.
Well, it's just a huge topic in our society. And and one that I personally am very afraid of. It's my greatest fear is dementia.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, my father, I mean, kind of rather obviously, this comes from a lot of personal experience. My dad had dementia for 10 years, and it is a very challenging thing for many families. And I think one of the things that I hope that we are able to do more as a society is, talk about someone's rights. We talk about you have a power of attorney for your healthcare decision. So when you are not able to speak for yourself, but they can't go this far. All assisted suicide is assisted suicide. You must be able to do it yourself. Now, do I know what the right answer is? No. But do we have to have the conversation? Absolutely. And we need to start, talking about what people would want and not put them in situations by force that they definitely don't want to be in.
What does your family think about your career as a writer, and especially on topics that may be more personal to you?
Well, my dad passed away in 2016, and this book, my mother passed away in 2020. And I had told her about the book, but I had told her she didn't want to read it because I don't think that it was something that she could have handled, reading, because it very much dealt with the topics that we were, dealing with. My immediate family, my husband and my daughter, are very supportive in a general sense. I like to, the word supportive is questionable because, they don't respect a closed door at all. So if I'm writing, they walk in and start talking to me and stuff. And to the degree that I think I need that to write now, I need the pending interruption to be like, I better get going and work on this. But they're very supportive. And I think that the topics I choose to write about, I think more challenging are friends. My next book, very much one of the main characters is based on a friend. And I had to call her because she's one of my biggest fans for this book. And I had to say, you're going to read this book and you're going to recognize yourself. It's not your story, but the scenario that sets up the story is very much her scenario. And so I think that's more challenging for me than my family.
And was she okay with that?
Yeah, she wanted to read it. Yeah, so she wants to read it, and I'm really looking forward to her opinion, because it was again a very challenging thing that she's been through. Her and I, I guess I can talk about it because it's my book, right? So it's finding out your son is a white supremacist. So sort of on the side, you're suddenly in his messages, and this person that you don't know is there, and this is a child, like a 13-year-old. So definitely, now her son is grown. So it's a very different experience, but taking that is kind of the heart of a challenge that you have with parenting.
Well, Deborah, you certainly don't write any little nondescript beach reads. You delve right into some very weighty subjects.
Yeah, definitely not a beach read, yeah.
What do you think is your writing kryptonite?
I think that writing is my writing kryptonite. I could, like I said, I could just keep doing this without any external engagement. And I did that for years. And so that getting out of that habit, forcing myself to be like, no, the goal is to have a reader. The goal is to get to that end product. It's wonderful to create, but the closing the circle is having the reader. So I think getting out of my comfort zone with that and being like, okay, I've got to go, get to this point where there's a published book, and I've got to go self-promote it, and I've got to talk about it, so.
And you've definitely done that. So congratulations.
Thank you. Well, this is like, this is step one, right? Yeah.
Well, as always, our last interview question is, our writers over 50 are quite a unique set. Do you have advice for writers 50 and above?
I think my advice for writers 50 and above is the same as like any writer, is to be more worried about the quality of the craft than anything. That is really the goal. The goal is not just to get a book out in the world. It's to get a book that you're happy and proud of out into the world. So don't rush it. Like I said, I'm a nurse. I work with brand new nurses, and there's a lot of competition to go to critical care, ICUs. And I always say them, it's the same thing. I was like, the goal is not to get there fast. The goal is to be good at it. And so I think it's the same thing for writing. It's to have something that you really believe is a quality thing that you're proud of, is more important than whether you do it at 50 or 55 or 60 or 65.
I agree. And I know that you have left a wonderful legacy just reading your first paragraph. You know, they tell us those first sentences are so crucial, and you have nailed that one. So I know you're leaving a legacy on a topic that many of us are going to want to read and discuss. I think it's a wonderful book for book clubs because it's going to bring up so many emotions and so many questions and answers that people want to have. So thank you for being with us and sharing today. And we're happy to now say that you're one of our authors over 50.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us today. Please look for Authors Over 50 every Thursday when we will have conversations with accomplished debut novelists over the age of 50. Please subscribe and share with a friend. And check out my own publication journey after 50 at www.juliadaily, that's DAILY, like dailynewspaper.com. Until next time, keep reading and writing. And remember, it's never too late to fulfill a dream in life's sweetest third.